Welcome back, adventurers and friends, to Adventures Inward Let's Talk series. For those who are here for the first time, hello, welcome, thank you for joining us. Just a reminder to hit that like button and be sure to subscribe. It's free. Don't forget to click on the notification bell if you would like to know when I post new videos. Today, we will be talking about some of the myths about grief that you may fall into believing, which could be detrimental to your coping and moving on, and discussing the actual facts contradicting the myths. So get comfy cozy, open your heart, open your mind, and let's get into it. Our reluctance to talk about grief can provide a space for myths to proliferate. Talking about grief and loss remains to be one of our society's greatest taboos. Most of us are even reluctant to use the word death, instead preferring gentler alternatives like passing away. And who could blame us? After all, it can be difficult, awkward, and even painful to discuss. Unfortunately, such reluctance can provide a space for myths about grief and loss to proliferate, making it harder for us to grieve in the long run. So here are some of the most common myths about grief, along with the actual facts. Myth 1. Grief is an emotion. One of the most common misconceptions about grief is that it's a feeling. Given that grief occurs in some of the most painful situations anyone can imagine, we generally associate it with depression. But grief is actually a process composed of many emotions, including expected ones like sadness, as well as more surprising ones like anger, frustration, guilt, or even shock. It's common during grief to experience positive feelings as well, such as relief that our loved one is out of pain. At times, people also can feel numb, almost like the death hadn't even happened. What's important to know is that all of these emotions, at least in measured amounts, are normal. Myth 2. Grief is bad. When most people think of grief, nothing good comes to mind. But researchers and counselors believe that the grief process itself is actually healthy. That's because grief is the mechanism that allows us to come to terms with loss. We all know that it takes time for our brains to adjust to change. If you've even moved to a new house or apartment, you know it can take months for the place to feel like home. During that time, our brain is slowly altering its pathways to accommodate to the new reality. When a loved one dies, it can likewise take significant time to adjust to what has just occurred. As we grapple with questions like, who am I without my loved one? How would my loved one want me to feel? How can I best honor their memory? Many grief experts believe that one of the functions of grief is to provide an opportunity for us to answer questions like these, ultimately allowing us to honor our loved one's memory and come to a place of acceptance. Myth 3. More grief is better. If we accept that grief can be good for us, it's tempting to conclude that more of it must be better. Even grief counselors have historically made this mistake. Known as the grief work hypothesis, counselors used to believe that it was necessary for people to vigorously confront their grief, keeping their minds on the loss as much as possible. If people didn't appear to be in great distress following the death of a loved one, it was feared that they might be suppressing or denying the loss, something that could come back to haunt them later. We now know that this isn't exactly true. Although some people naturally grieve in an intense way, others don't. Both can be healthy, though. Research by Columbia University shows that people follow different grief trajectories. The majority of people follow one of two relatively healthy grief trajectories. About 10 to 20% of people follow a so-called quote-unquote recovery trajectory. After a loss, they may initially experience difficulty functioning and intensely painful emotions like depression. But after a period of months, they gradually recover and return to their lives. This is the trajectory most of us imagine when we hear the word grief. But it's not actually the most common trajectory. That's because around 50 to 60% experience a different grief journey, known as resilience trajectory. These individuals are able to maintain relatively stable, healthy levels of functioning, even in the immediate aftermath of a loss. Although from the outside they may appear pretty normal, this doesn't mean they're in denial. Inside, they still miss their loved one and still experience some of the grief-related emotions mentioned earlier. Because both the recovery and resilience trajectories ultimately allow people to move through grief to a place of healthy functioning, they're both considered normal. Myth 4. There is a right way to grieve. One of the most widely known and accepted psychological ideas is that grief is composed of 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. What you may not know, however, is that the creator of these stages, luminary psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, didn't originally develop them to explain what people experience when they lose a person they love. Instead, she developed them to describe the process patients go through as they come to terms with their own terminal illnesses. Only later were the stages applied to grieving friends and family members who seem to undergo a similar process after loss. But grief turns out not to be so simple. Studies now show that although some grievers may progress through these stages, many don't. They might skip stages, repeat stages, or even experience emotions not captured in the original 5 stages. In reality, the grief process looks a lot less like a neat set of stages and a lot more like a roller coaster of emotions. In fact, no stage theory to date has been able to fully account for how people cope with loss. Grief is different for each person and each loss, so it's important not to force yourself to fit into someone else's idea of what grief should look like. Myth 5. Grief counseling is harmful. Several years ago, media outlets reported a shocking story. Research appeared to show that grief counseling could be harmful for a large number of people. Researchers had performed a complicated statistical procedure known as a meta-analysis, collectively analyzing the data from a number of studies investigating the effectiveness of grief counseling. They found what came to be known as the treatment-induced deterioration effect, or TIDE for short. Although the study was never published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal, the media trumpeted the seemingly alarming findings. Newsweek ran an article titled, "Get Shrunk at Your Own Risk." Time magazine called grief counseling a quote-unquote myth. As a result, people who might have benefited from grief counseling chose not to access it. But the TIDE finding turned out to be flawed, As a result of all the publicity, the American Psychological Association was asked to review the findings. They convened a team of 2 statistical and methodical experts who, after careful deliberation, concluded that the particular meta-analytic statistic used to produce the TIDE findings was problematic and the conclusions suspect. Since that time, there has been no good evidence that grief counseling is harmful. It's important to note, however, that grief counseling probably isn't necessary for most people. Think about it. Human beings have been experiencing losses since our species first emerged approximately 300,000 years ago. The profession of counseling has only existed for about 100 of those years. For the most part, grief is hardwired into the brain. On some primitive level, we just know how to do it, even without professional help. Most people's grief will naturally soften with time. This doesn't mean grief counseling can't be helpful, however. It certainly can help to talk. Although research shows that counseling for grief doesn't appear to be quite as effective as for other conditions, studies show that when people choose to attend counseling because they're experiencing difficulties with grief, is generally helpful. So, you shouldn't hesitate to visit a grief counselor. If you feel you need guidance and support in your grief process, chances are you'll be happy you did it. Here are my final thoughts. Despite all the myths, one truth is undeniable. If we haven't already, every one of us eventually will lose people we love, from a grandparent to a dear friend. As much as we would like to have a magic wand that would make people live forever, none of us has that wand. Fortunately, even though grief can be a painful process, it may be just the medicine we need to help us honor our loved one's memory, come to terms with our loss, and ultimately take one step at a time toward a healthy future. It's something our fellow human beings have been doing since time immemorial, so none of us is alone. Remember to be kind to yourself, give yourself grace, and always, always love yourself. Thank you for joining me.